Now, in section 2, we're going to see another effect of the age of exploration. It's the growth of the slave trade. Now, before the discovery of the New World and its settlement by the Europeans, there was already a pre-existing slave trade in Africa. Slaves would be taken from the East Coast, for instance, and sold into the Arabic world, and there was a market for slaves on the European continent. But with the discovery of the New World, the slave trade is going to grow dramatically. As Europeans began to establish large plantations in the New World, particularly in the Caribbean and the coast of Brazil. At first, remember the point of Asia exploration is to make money, mercantilism. You want gold and silver flowing into your country, so they start to create these plantations, really big farms, and the crop that actually triggered the growth of the slave trade is not cotton. We often associate cotton in the slave trade, but it was the growth of sugar cane. There was a lot of money to be made in sugar. Now, at first, the Europeans tried to enslave the natives that were already in the New World. That didn't work because of the diseases, taking out so many of the natives. Sometimes the natives would escape, and when they escaped, they basically escaped into their backyard, their home turf. So the Europeans began to import slaves from Africa. So what is developed between the New World, Europe, and Africa is something called the triangular trade route. So the way it would work is in the Caribbean, as I said, you had those large sugarcane plantations. Eventually, other crops like tobacco was grown. And so you would have raw goods shipped from the New World to Europe. That's one leg of the triangle. And then from Europe, manufactured goods or finished goods would be shipped to Africa, particularly guns. And then from Africa to the New World, there of course would be the slaves. That's why if you visit the Caribbean, parts of Brazil, you will see many people of African descent, right? Because their ancestors were brought over here during this time period to work those plantations, particularly the sugarcane plantations. So you have this triangular trade route going between these three areas, the New World, Europe, and Africa. And of course, the worst part of the trip, the worst part of the route would be the Middle Passage, the trip the slaves took from Africa to the New World in absolutely horrendous conditions. Here's another map with a little more detail. So you can see some of the items coming from the New World: tobacco and cotton, sugar, molasses, which is like a really thick syrup, cotton, sugar, and then those raw goods being shipped to Europe, turned into manufactured goods, particularly guns, brought to Africa, traded for slaves, and the slaves shipped back to the New World, as you see in the Caribbean and Brazil, and eventually in the American South, what will become the American South. And so the Middle Passage is the trip the slaves took in absolutely horrendous conditions, because these slave traders, these slave merchants, viewed the slaves like cargo, not like people. So they are going to try to pack as many slaves as possible onto their ships. There are even manuals and pamphlets on how to pack the slaves in the most efficient way in your ship. You can see that they would be laid out head to toe in every spare space. You hear stories of slaves refusing to eat, going on hunger strike basically, and being force fed. You hear of slaves that were disobedient being thrown overboard. You hear stories of slaves being disobedient would be beaten to death, as an example to the rest of the slaves. So these people, they're taken from their culture. At times they're often kidnapped, and they're taken from their culture and taken from their family. They don't know where they're going, and they spend horrendous months on these ships. And they get to the New World, and then they are sold at auction like cattle, basically, right? And this classified, that this ad is a great example of the triangle trade route. So this ad was in 1767, and it's placed in a newspaper in Annapolis, in Maryland. It says, "In the ship Lord Ligonier, Captain Davies from the river Gambia in Africa, and to be sold by the subscriber in Annapolis for cash or good bills of exchange on Wednesday the 7th of October next, a cargo of choice healthy slaves." So this guy, Captain Davies, is announcing, hey, on October 7th, we are going to sell off our cargo, as he called it, of slaves. Then the rest of that says the said ship, or the same ship, will take tobacco to London, and we're going to buy it at £6 sterling per ton. So that's the raw goods, right? Leaving the New World, going back to Europe. And I'm sure once he gets back to London and unloads the tobacco, He's then going to fill his ship up with finished goods, go back to the River Gambia, and it starts all over again. The Triangle Trade Route, linking these three areas of the world. Now, the sources for most of the slaves coming to the New World, of course, it's going to be along the west coast of Africa, where Ghana is today, because that's the part of Africa that faces closest to the New World. And it's had a horrendous effect on Africa, as you can imagine. There's actually an African king, King Afonso. He converted to Catholicism, converted to Christianity, viewed himself as an ally and friend of the Portuguese, but then the Portuguese slave trade was devastating his kingdom. He actually wrote a letter to the King of Portugal saying, "We beg of your highness as a great favor to do this for us, because besides being good in itself, it is in the service of God, as we have said above," begging the Portuguese to stop this slave trade. King Afonso says, "Our people want your goods so badly, those manufactured goods, that some of our people are kidnapping people and selling them to you illegally. Please stop, please stop, please stop." And of course, it does not stop. So what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to make a simple chart like the one you see on the screen. And in just a second, there's going to be a list of cause and effects, items, ideas pop up on the screen, and you just have to determine, all right, does that go under the cause column, or does that go under the effect column, the causes of the slave trade, or is it an effect of the slave trade? And you can just pause the video for as long as you need to get that accomplished. So you're going to put these where they belong on the chart, under the causes or under the effects. So causes of the slave trade, as said, demand for labor to grow the sugar cane, and they tried to enslave the natives of the New World. That did not work, so they tapped into the pre-existing slave trade that already existed in Africa, and then made it grow dramatically. Local African rulers viewed the slave trade as a source of income. Either we'll be taking the slaves, or we're going to take the other people as slaves. So we might as well take them as slaves and make money off of it. And then there were demands for household servants in Europe. But that was a pretty small part of the slave trade. Effect of the slave trade, increased warfare among African peoples. That's how a lot of times the slaves were acquired. One tribe or one nation attacks another and captures people and sell them to the Portuguese or to the Spanish or to the English as slaves. So you're going to see an increase of warfare, which of course is going to also lead to an increase of deaths among these African people. Depopulation in some African countries because of the constant warfare, because of the constant attacks. Also, many Africans moved deeper into the continent of Africa to try to escape the slave trade. And of course, this is going to have a negative effect on African culture too. It's going to be hard to maintain some of these African cultures. Once great tribes like the Benin, it's highly advanced people, they're going to start falling apart during this time period. There was another effect also. Slavery was not new. The Romans, for instance, had slaves, but there's a bit of a difference between slavery in the Roman Empire and the slavery that we're talking about in the age of exploration, because the Romans would enslave pretty much anyone that they conquered. This more modern type of slavery was based purely on race. They were only enslaving Africans, right? So the Europeans had to develop racist ideas to try to justify what they are doing. And of course, we're still feeling the effects of that today. So if you are a slave owner in the New World, you have to justify to yourself, make excuses to yourself on why it's okay for you as a quote-unquote Christian to enslave other people. And so all these myths, all these falsehoods are developed and spread. The idea that the African people are naturally less intelligent and they need the white man to guide them. Or this idea that, hey, yes, they're a slave, but at least over here they're Christians and they're not free heathens over in Africa, which of course is bogus, by the way. You can just send missionaries to Africa. You don't have to enslave them. That doesn't make any sense. There's this idea that, well, now they're over here, so we have to keep them enslaved because they're dangerous, because they're naturally violent, which is also bogus. So the white race has to develop all these ideas to justify to themselves, hey, this is why we are in charge and this is why they are on the bottom. And then when slavery is eventually made illegal in the New World, and after the Civil War here in the United States, those racist ideas have been around for centuries, and it's going to take a long time for them to go away. So we're still dealing with the consequences of the slave trade and this development of racism to try to justify it.